Hi, today we're going to talk about the native New World. In this Thursday class, you'll be discussing this concept. And we've talked about the New World in general, that is, thinking about the New World as a place where native peoples first come into contact with the peoples of Europe, peoples of the Atlantic world. That includes European colonial settlers, also Africans, also people that are engaged in trade that links them to other parts of the Americas and connecting them with the Spanish territories, with the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean. This Atlantic world that we've talked about, however, has an important counterpart that I call the native New World. This is a vast territory in the interior of the continent, in the western interior in particular, the Great Lakes, the Great Plains, the northern boreal forests in the north, all of which are essential to the fur trade that has become a sort of mainstay, economically, so to speak, of North America's discovery, contact, and settlement. All the native peoples in the interior in this region are really pivotal to the fur trade because this is where the best fur-bearing animals are being harvested. So primarily beaver, but also lynx, bobcats, deer, buffalo, martens, etc., etc. Although the primary trade is in beaver pelts, but this is a massive worldwide trade, and the people that are engaged in this trade are part of an emerging global market economy that is part of modernity. And they are transformed, not unlike the people at the Wampanoags on the East Coast or the Delaware in the New York and Delaware River areas. But the big difference is that you don't have large colonial settlements. You don't have large groups of colonists who are taking over land, pushing people off land, getting into armed conflict. Instead, what you have are a small number of people, usually associated with the French Empire, sometimes also with the English and Spanish empires, who move through this vast territory as traders. They also come together as villages and make trips annually into places like Quebec and Montreal, where they engage in trade in these port cities. But the key point here is that you have a world that is not unlike the East Coast, being transformed by the introduction of new things, new people, new ideas, new material goods. And these material goods can be helpful things like steel awls, axes, blades, pots, etc., but also microbes that introduce disease can reconfigure communities. In any event, what we're going to look at is the ways in which the native peoples in the interior are transformed by their contact and trade with Europeans and with their empires. And in order to do this, we're going to have to sort of go through a couple of documents this week that capture this experience, the Europeans moving through a largely Indian landscape, but one that's not timeless and unchanged, but actually something that's been evolving since contact, even though there aren't European settlers. Now, one of the problems that this will place before us is the idea of Indian names. Most tribal peoples in North America get assigned names after their encounter with Europeans, and these names don't always reflect what the tribes themselves would call themselves, how they would self-identify. And in the documents that you'll be reading for Thursday's class, there are lots of tricky names, so we're going to review some of this stuff to try to give you a sense of who's who. Now, most of these documents, as I said, will talk about peoples in the Great Lakes, in the west of the Mississippi region, the Great Plains, and the northern boreal forest. Now, these people show up in records as Algonquins in the most large category. Algonquin is a linguistic group, like Romance languages. The Algonquin is a language stock that's shared by large numbers of people. For example, most of the people inhabiting the Great Lakes. The French identified the people in the Great Lakes as Sauteurs. This is because they first encountered them at Sault Ste. Marie in northern Michigan. And when they ask those people who they are, they say, "We are the people from the Falls," which in French translates as Sauteurs. These same people would call themselves Gitchigaming Anishinaabeg, which is a way of saying real human beings from the Great Lakes. But they are also called Algonquins, as I mentioned, by Europeans. These Algonquins would include all the Anishinaabe people, who you could now identify as Ottawa or Odawa, Nipissing, Amiquois, Mississauga, Jean de Terre. All these are names that you'll find in documents. Nopameng Deja Irani is the name that also gets applied for Jean de Terre. That's the Ojibwe language version of that name, and it actually means kind of country people, which the French translate as people from the country, Jean de Terre. So these people will all show up in the records that you're reading, as well as the Huron or Wyandot. The Huron are an Iroquoian-speaking people, not an Algonquin-speaking people. But these are all names that will show up. Sauteurs are people that you might now call, as I said, Odawa, Ojibwe, or Potawatomi, that currently reside in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and large parts of Ontario. Now, the Huron we will return to later on. The other people that you'll encounter in your readings for this week are the Nottoway Sioux, or the Dakota people. These are the people in the Mississippi region. Everybody most likely knows who the Sioux are. This is a name that the French applied to the Sioux in classic fashion by asking their Ojibwe partners whom they're trading with, who are the people to the west? And the Ojibwe people answer Nottoway-Siwa, which would be translated as foreign-speaking people. The French transcribed this as Nottoway-Sioux, and over time it gets shortened to Sioux. You'll also find people that the French identify as Cree. These are the people in the northern boreal forest on the north of Lake Superior. They call themselves Muskegowuk-Finowik, which is, again, swampland people. They're also identified in these documents by Europeans as people of the north, just a vague sort of category of identity that they're assigning. This is a kind of contemporary map of what would now be the western northern peninsula of Michigan, and also Wisconsin Territory. There are a number of village sites along the southern shore of Lake Superior that become swelled in population. The fights that we have talked about in class, the Pequot War, the King Philip's War, conflict with English in the East actually produces large numbers of refugees. This is exacerbated, as we'll get to later in this class, by violence perpetrated by Iroquois who are taking over trade routes and displacing people. So you have large numbers of refugees coming to join the village populations of the Sauteurs, the Algonquins. And then moving into the western shore of Lake Michigan and the southern shoreline villages of Anishinaabe people and swelling those village communities up. And the effect is that you have essentially a large number of multi-ethnic villages, so villages with more than one tribal group. And this makes trade super important, as we've discussed. The exchange of goods and making sure that people in your community are well provided for is a hallmark of social cohesion and power in Native North America. Now, one of the points of conflict, as I mentioned, is the rise of the Iroquois League. This is a confederacy, calling themselves the Haudenosaunee, that we discussed on Tuesday's class. This is a nice map that represents their territory from east to west: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. The Iroquois, as you have discussed in Tuesday's class, come together sometime, archaeologists believe, in the way they tell the story themselves, in the 14th and 15th century during times of violence when communities are at war with one another. And the story that we've reviewed on Tuesday, The Great Peace, is a way by which a philosophy of peace and political ideology of confederation comes together that allow the five nations of the Haudenosaunee to cooperate in much the way, let's say, the United States does, or any other sort of national power, as five member nations of a confederacy. And this gives them a great deal of power and authority. Each of these tribal nations has somewhere between 2.5 and 10,000 people. You have a total social formation in the entire league of probably well over 40 or 50,000 people. That's a large number of people. New France, by 1700, for example, is only about 11 or 12,000 people in that settlement. Plymouth Colony by the 1660s, I believe, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40,000 people. So this is a large number of native peoples who, unlike the tribal people such as the Wampanoag, can come together as a large group and put effectively large armies in the field that would make them comparable to European powers. And this makes them very important players in the fur trade. As I mentioned, they straddle the communications line that connects the interior where the furs are being caught and processed, and the Mohawk River, Hudson's Valley intersections that in the St. Lawrence that bring river routes that bring these animal pelts out to trade with the colonial settlements of Europe established by Europeans on the coast. In addition, if we go back to this same image, on the shore of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, there are other Iroquoian speakers. Iroquoian is another language group that the Iroquois Confederacy speak. These other Iroquoian speakers include the Susquehannock, south of the Iroquois, the Erie, Wenros, Petuns, and Neutrals in the western southern shores of Lakes Erie and Ontario, and also the Wendat or the Wyandot. They're on the Ontario Peninsula. We'll be discussing them in a few minutes. These are other names that you will find in your readings for the weeks. The Iroquois conceptualize themselves as a people of a longhouse. This is an example of a longhouse. These are large cedar bark structures in which the Iroquois members of the Iroquois nations live. These are multi-family dwellings. Each longhouse can contain as many as 5 or 6 families. Imagine each family with anywhere between 6 to 10 people. This is a place for food storage, a place for bedding. Each family has a central hearth or a central fire. Most of these communities that the Iroquois live in are palisaded communities. In fact, Europeans refer to them as castles. They have large palisaded walls. As I mentioned, the Iroquois themselves came together in a time period of great violence and chaos, and that violence and chaos is amplified by the arrival of Europeans and competition over trade and trade routes. So the large palisaded communities created by the Iroquois give them a very distinct advantage. They are an excellent source for allowing them to preserve their power, protect themselves. We also have discussed wampum. The story that you learned about the Great Peace is told through wampum strands. These belts come to symbolize the stories of Daganoweda and Tadadeo, the two main players in the arrival of the Great Peace that we talked about in Tuesday's class. Wampum also becomes an important item of diplomatic value, that tribes hand wampum strands, wampum belts to one another as signs of either war or alliance making. This circulates along with trade goods. Now, the thing we're going to talk about here is the shifts that are happening in the interior, often in advance of European settlement. Samuel Champlain, who sets up Quebec in 1608 and then Montreal, I think, by 1620, is preceded by almost 100 years by Jacques Cartier, who actually sails up the St. Lawrence River and finds Stadacona and Hoclia, two large 2,000 to 3,000 person village communities on the St. Lawrence. By the time the French return in 1608, those villages are gone. Nobody's entirely sure why. They are Iroquoian speakers. Most scholars believe they have since that time transformed themselves into the Wendat, also called the Wyandot, also called the Huron. Now, the Huron, like the Iroquois, are Iroquoian-speaking peoples and a confederacy. They are originally three main nations of the Wendat Confederacy, living in multiple units. They are approximately 30 to 40,000 people at the time that the French arrive, and they, like the Iroquois, are also living in palisaded villages. They are horticulturalists. They grow corn, beans, and squash, and they are engaged in extensive trade with people in the Great Lakes farther to the west. These are people who are living in a colder territory where it's less possible for them to farm, and so they're circulating through a seasonal round that mainly relies on gathering fish, wild rice, hunting, and they're exchanging those things, surplus pelts and so forth, for surplus agricultural corn, beans, and squash produced by the Wendat Confederacy. Now, the Wendat very quickly becomes entangled with French settlers. Large portions of the Wendat suffer from disease. This causes a large portion of the Wendat to also seek conversion to Christianity as they try to find some new source of power to protect them. This causes internal political divisions. All these things make them vulnerable to the Iroquois, and the Iroquois begin raiding in the early 1600s into the Wendat territory, and they're raiding both to take over lands that are valuable in terms of their hunting and trade routes, but they're also taking away captives. The Iroquois are not immune to disease. They too are losing population, and as you'll see from the readings this week, they are replacing large portions of that population with captives who they then bring in to socialize as being Iroquois, members of their own society. So between the raiding, the warfare, the captivity, the disease, the internal discord, the Wendat themselves finally abandon their homeland in 1650. A portion does stay behind and enter into various walled cities that are essentially missions, but a large portion of the Wendat, along with the Erie's neutral Huron and Petun, other Iroquois speakers, move into the village communities, as I discussed, of Anishinaabe people or Great Lakes people. And they move from then until the 1700s, really, through various communities in the Great Lakes, basically seeking refuge from the Iroquois and their English allies. And these people become essential to the French Empire because, as I mentioned, these multi-ethnic units need to function as allies if they're going to survive. And the French Empire and the French fur trade ends up helping be a sort of glue that holds these multi-ethnic communities together. And these are the people who then form the backbone of the French alliance and allow them to, in fact, claim huge chunks of territory in the western interior of North America that they haven't actually settled, but that they claim through right of discovery and by virtue of their alliance with native peoples who live in these spaces. That's the end of the slides for this week. This should give you some help for talking through the materials you have with Frank in terms of identifying people, moving between the Great Lakes and Hudson's Bay, competition between the British and French over the fur trade, etc. I'll see you on Tuesday. Goodbye.